Hello students, today we are going to learn about the chapter The Invention of Vita Wonk. This chapter is included in your text Honeycomb. Before learning the story of this chapter, let us know about the author of this chapter, Roald Dahl. Yes, this is how his name is pronounced. D of Roald is silent. So Roald Dahl was a British novelist, short story writer, poet, screenwriter, and a wartime fighter pilot who had served in the Royal Air Force during Second World War. He had written many stories and was particularly famous for his book Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which was even adopted into a movie. So, the story is basically about an eccentric scientist who is trying to invent a medicine. Let us dive into the chapter to know more about this medicine. Now, this chapter is an extract from the story titled Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator. So, it is a children's book written by a British author Roald Dahl, and it is a sequel to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which is a very interesting story in itself. You should definitely read it on the internet. So, continuing the story of young Charlie Bucket and chocolatier Willy Wonka as they travel in the great glass elevator. So, what is an elevator? Elevator is a lift which is used to carry people. Mr. Willy Wonka begins by inventing Wonka White. So, in our story, the main character is Mr. Willy Wonka. He begins by inventing Wonka White. What is Wonka White? Wonka White is a medicine which makes people younger. But Wonka White is too strong. So some people disappear. Why? Because their age becomes minus. One person actually became minus 87, which means he's got to wait 87 years before coming back. Willy Wonka must invent a new thing. Now there is an emergency here because he has tested this medicine which is called Wonka White on a person, and that person became so young that he actually disappeared. Instead of becoming a baby, he just vanishes. He vanishes and goes into the world of spirits, goes into the world of ghosts. And now he has to do something in order to bring that person back. Mr. Wonka said, so once again, I rolled up my sleeves and set to work. Once again, I squeezed my brain, searching for the new recipe. I had to create age to make people old, older, oldest. Ha ha, I cried. For now, the ideas were beginning to come. What is the oldest living thing in the world? What lives longer than anything else? So now, Mr. Wonka, who is our chocolatier here, the owner of the chocolate factory, the one who makes chocolates, he is also an eccentric scientist. He has invented a number of things, and now he has again rolled up his sleeves and set to work. So, what does rolling up my sleeves means? It means that he's getting ready. He's getting ready to do something and get to work. And once again, he's squeezed his brain. So, squeezed his brain. Squeezing here means to think hard. Why is he thinking hard? Because he has to find a recipe which could bring back those people whose age had gone to minus. He had to make those people old again in order to bring back to life. And he's laughing himself. He laughs at the fact that he's going to make people old, older, and oldest. So ideas had started to come in his mind what he could do in order to bring back those people. He wonders what is the oldest living thing in the world? What is that which lives longer than anyone else? A tree, Charlie said. Now, who is Charlie? Charlie is the assistant of Mr. Willy Wonka. So, Mr. Wonka, he asks Charlie, what is the oldest thing? And Charlie very wisely replies that yes, it's a tree. Right, you are, Charlie. But what kind of a tree? Not the Douglas fir, not the oak, not the cedar, No, no, my boy. It is a tree called the bristlecone pine that grows upon the slopes of Wheeler Peak in Nevada, USA. So basically, he has named different trees here. That is the Douglas fir. Douglas fir is a tree which has leaves like needles, like this. You can see it here in the picture as well. This is how a fir tree looks like. It has needle-like leaves. Then he talks about the cedar tree. Now this is how a cedar tree looks like. Then he also talks about the oak tree. Oak tree is a very huge tree. It has a large trunk and wide spreading branches. It also lives for many years. But the last and the most important tree that he talks about is the bristlecone pine. The fourth image here is of the bristlecone pine. See, when you look at it, it looks really old, right? So this tree can be found in USA. Where in USA? On the slopes of Wheeler Peak in Nevada. An interesting fact about these trees is that they are over 4,000 years old. This is fact, Charlie. He says that this is a fact. You can ask any dendrochronologist. Now, who's a dendrochronologist? He is someone who studies the rings on a tree to determine their age, the climate where those trees live, and some other conditions. So, dendrochronologists are basically able to guess the age of a tree using the rings which are there if you cut that trunk. So that started me off. That was the main thing which gave him more and more ideas. The idea of trees created more and more ideas in his mind, and he was able to, think about many things which were old. I jumped into the great glass elevator and rushed all over the world collecting special items from the oldest living things. So, as I've told you before, elevator is a lift. If you must have gone to a mall, you must have seen, if you have to go from one floor to another, you use a lift. So, the idea of this tree gave him many other ideas, and he gets on his great glass elevator. And this is not an ordinary elevator which takes you from one floor to another, but this is a special magical elevator which can carry you around the world. Of course, this story is a fictional one. It's not a real story. So, fictional story is a story that is not real, which is imaginary. Okay, so after climbing on his great glass elevator, he goes all over the world and he collects special items from the oldest living things which are present there. A pint of sap from a 4,000-year-old bristlecone pine. So, what is a pint? A pint is a measurement equivalent to 1.69 liters, and sap means the juice of any plant. So, he brings this juice from a 4,000-year-old bristlecone pine. So, from where does he get the juice? Maybe by cutting its trunk. So, if you must have seen some of the trees, when you slightly slice its trunk, then it will start to produce a kind of sap, which is a kind of a liquid, right? So, he brings that sap, he collects it in order to invent this medicine which could help people age, which could help people grow older. Why does he want to make people older? Because with his previous invention, he had turned a person, his age, to minus. It means even before the stage when he was born. Then the second thing that he collects is toenail clippings. So toenail, you know what a toenail is? The nail on your toes. So a toenail from one old Russian farmer called Petrovich Grigorovich. An egg laid by a 200-year-old tortoise belonging to the king of Tonga, the tail of a 51-year-old horse in Arabia, the whiskers of a 36-year-old cat called crumpets. So you know what are whiskers? If you must have seen a cat usually has these whiskers, okay? So he gets those whiskers from a 36-year-old cat. So cats don't usually live for so long, 36 years. And the same goes for horses as well. Horses also don't live for 51-year-old. But tortoises, they do live for a very long period of time. Okay. So He gets all of these things from the oldest living things available on earth. An old flea which had lived on crumpet for 36 years. So imagine, can a flea, can an insect live for 36 years? It's impossible. All of these are just made up by the author. So what is a flea? A flea is a wingless insect which does not have wings, right? And it sucks blood. The tale of a 207-year-old giant rat. You know what a rat is? A rat is a bigger form of a mouse. It's from the same family of mouse, but it's quite bigger in size. If you must have seen Harry Potter, the character Ron Weasley, he owned a rat. But imagine this rat was 207 years old. Then the black teeth of a 97-year-old grimalkin. Now, what is grimalkin? An old female cat living in a cave on Mount Popocatépetl. This mountain is pronounced as Popocatépetl. It means smoking mountain. It is actually a volcano which is situated in Mexico, and it is one of the most active volcanoes out there. Near that volcano, there used to live this old cat from which Willy Wonka gets this black teeth. Then the knuckle bones. What are knuckle bones? Knuckle bones are the bones at the finger joint. Like suppose this is your hand, these are your fingers. There are bone joints that you must have noticed. So those are called knuckle bones. Now my drawing is not really good. Okay. So knuckle bones of not a human, of a 700-year-old catalu from Peru. Now this is how a catalu looks like. You can see here in the picture. Okay. So he collects all of these things from the oldest living beings which were there. All over the world, Charlie, Mr. Wonka went on. He's telling his assistant Charlie that he went all over the world in order to collect these samples from the oldest living creatures on earth. He says, I tracked down very old and ancient animals also and took an important little bit of something from each one of them. Okay, so he tracked means to follow something. So he followed very ancient animals and took a part of their body in order to make that medicine. A hair or an eyebrow, or sometimes it was no more than an ounce or two of the jam scraped from between its toes while it was sleeping. That is quite disgusting, right? Can you imagine? He scraped from the toes. He scraped dirt from the toes of those old animals. I tracked down the whistle pig, the bobolink, the scrock, the polyfrog, the giant curlicue. So now see, this bird is called bobolink. The young one of a frog is called polyfrog, right? And a giant curlicue is basically this fancy curling shape which is made from a series of concentric circles. So this kind of a design is called curlicue. The stinging slug, this is what a stinging slug looks like, and a venomous squircle. Now, what's a venomous squircle? Any animal that produces poison. So he collects parts of their bodies. It might have been a hair, it might have been some dirt which was collected on their feet, on their toes. Okay, so he collects all of these things in order to make his medicine. Some of the words which have been used here, they are imaginary. For example, the whistle pig and the scrock, they actually do not exist. They are imaginary animals that have been created by the author in order to make it fun. Then Mr. Willy Wonka says, but there is no time to tell you about them all now, Charlie. He says, I cannot go into details what all I did in order to procure these things, in order to get these things so that I could make my medicine. He says, let me just quickly say that in end, after lots of boiling and bubbling and mixing and testing in my inventing room, I produced one tiny cupful of oily black liquid and gave 4 drops of it to a brave 20-year-old Oompa Loompa volunteer to see what happened. So he says that I'm not going to waste my time in telling you all the details, the hard work that I did to collect all of these things. But let me tell you, after putting in so much of my effort, And after putting all of those things in my inventory, that is in my chemistry lab, I boiled all of these things together. I mixed a lot of things in there, I added a number of things in there, and I finally made a tiny cupful. Tiny cupful means equal to the size of a cup. So I made a tiny cupful of an oily black liquid, and then gave only 4 drops of it to a brave 20-year-old Oompa Loompa. So Oompa Loompa might be the name of this volunteer. So he says, I gave these 4 drops to this brave volunteer. Why is he calling him brave? He's calling him brave because this boy, he was ready to be tested by this medicine. He did not know what is going to happen to him if he drinks this medicine, but still he is willing to take the risk. So volunteer is basically someone who wishes to help. Nobody is forcing him to help, but who comes forward and helps in a noble cause. So now Charlie is curious. He wants to know what happens. So he asks the same. He says, what happened? What did happen? So Mr. Wonka cried. It was fantastic. So cried here does not mean that he was shedding tears. He shouted very loudly. Cried means to shout very loudly. So he says, it was fantastic. The moment he swallowed it, he began wrinkling and shriveling up all over, and his hair started dropping off, and his teeth started falling out. And before I knew it, he had suddenly become an old fellow of 17. So what had happened? As soon as that brave volunteer, he had those 4 drops of that medicine created by Mr. Willy Wonka, he started to shrivel up. To shrivel up means to shrink in size. You must have seen raisins that you eat. Raisin is a kind of a dry fruit which is made from grapes. So grapes, when they shrivel, they turn to raisins. Okay, similarly, this young boy who was very healthy, very tall, he turned into an old man. His teeth, they start to drop off. His hair also started to fall. And before Mr. Wonka knew it, suddenly he had become an old fellow who was 75 years of age. Imagine that poor boy who was only 20, but because of having those 4 drops, he turned into a 75-year-old man. And thus, my dear Charlie, Vita Wonk was invented. So then he realizes he was successful in making this Vita Wonk, which could age people. So, in order to know what happens next in the story and what was the backstory, you should go through this story titled Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator and its prequel, which is Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I hope that you enjoyed listening to the chapter. Thank you.